Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here at Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart and it's wonderful to be back. I've been away for a wee while, but I'm here back in the studio and delighted to be joined with our guest tonight, Professor John Robertson, formerly of UWS. There's three letters that I shouldn't get mixed up, but there I did. I'm about to do the Ukrainian update, so it doesn't augur well. However, John, delighted to see you and thank you for joining us tonight on the programme.
My pleasure.
So, as we always do, we're going to begin with the Ukrainian update on day 552 of the illegal Russian attempted invasion of Ukraine. And today, more than 1,300 schools, it was reported, have been destroyed in government-led areas of Ukraine since Russia's 2022 invasion, according to UNICEF. And Vladimir Putin has no plans to attend the funeral of Wagner mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was killed when his plane crashed last week, according to the Kremlin. Ukraine has said that its forces had pushed deeper into Russian defensive lines near the village of Robertson today, the day after they claimed to be in control over the village on the southern front. Unsurprisingly, Russian President Vladimir Putin will skip the G20 summit in India next month and will instead send Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's office has reported. Russia's air defences claim to have downed Ukrainian drones over the Tula and Belgorod regions. On Monday, the US accused Moscow of attempting to intimidate and harass US employees after Russian state media reported that a former US consulate worker had been charged by security services with collecting information on the war in Ukraine and other issues for Washington. European Union Chief Charles Michel said that the European Union should get ready to admit new members from Eastern Europe and the Balkans by 2030. And Pope Francis has come under criticism on Monday for telling Russian youths to remember that they are the heirs of Tsars such as Peter the Great, whom President Vladimir Putin has held up as an example to justify the invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine said the comments, which Francis made on Friday in a live video addressed to Catholic youths gathered in St. Petersburg, were deeply regrettable. John, I've been away from here for a wee while and the conflict has continued and continued to be much the same as it was before. But there's certainly, in terms of what has happened with Prigozhin, a turn somewhere, and one wonders whether this is Putin turning the screws and tightening his grip on Russia, or it is perhaps indicative of the possibility that Russia might be beginning to lose itself in amongst this conflict.
I would never be so stupid as to think I know what's going to happen next year. I do remember as a young man living during the Vietnam War, that we thought, will this ever end? You know, it seemed when I was at school in the late 60s and into the early 70s, it seems like the Vietnam would never end. It seemed like Nixon would just continue to up the stakes, more bombing, more deaths, but then it stopped. In 1975, it stopped. It came to an end. This war will end. It would be a rare phenomenon if it doesn't end in a few years' time. But I've got no idea what is happening with regard to... Someone has just burst into my study now. Someone only 3 years old, so we'll let him off with it. And that's the door shutting again now. Okay, so I can concentrate. I thought I was going to get kicked, you see, or tackled by a 3-year-old there. Yeah, so so we're on conflict all the time here, clearly. So as I said at the beginning, I've got no idea what's happening in Russia. And there are people, I see them on Sky TV coming on, pointing at bits of a big map of southern Ukraine and pontificating and seeming to think the former US journals, they haven't a Scooby any more than I have. But it will end.
Indeed, and we go from a conflict that doesn't seem to end whilst we attempt, just proves that we're live, of course, to Home, where new statistics have shown that homelessness is on the rise in Scotland in 2023. And this is new statistics covering 2022 to 23, which have been released today by Scotland's chief statistician. The statistics show that homelessness and rough sleeping have increased since the 2021-2022 period. The report, which covers from the 1st of April 2022 to the 31st of March this year, presents information on local authority homelessness applications, assessments and outcomes. And it provides data on the number of households in temporary accommodation. These statistics have shown that 32,242 households were assessed as being homeless or threatened with homelessness, a 10% increase compared to the previous year. That is also higher than pre-pandemic levels. There were also around 39,006 applications for homelessness assistance, an increase of 9% from 2021 to 22. Households in temporary accommodation had also increased in comparison with previous years, with the number of children in temporary accommodation being increased by 9% in March of the year, more than it was in 2022. Of course, following emergency legislation during the COVID-19 pandemic, households becoming homelessness from a private rented tenancy was at an all-time low. However, when the legislation was lifted in May 2021, numbers began to increase. Further legislation around the cost of living in October last year saw the number of households being made homeless from private rented tenancy fall to 2,200. Rough sleeping has also seen an increase, with 2,438 households reported sleeping rough during the previous 3 months. However, these numbers remain lower than pre-pandemic levels. The report also states that there were 445 recorded instances of households not being offered temporary accommodation during following applications, and that this is a decrease of 38% in comparison to 2021-22. Almost all of these, 420 of them, were in Edinburgh. The average length of time to close a homelessness case has also been increasing over time and reached an average of 266 days in 2022-23, compared to 262 days in 2021-22 and 226 pre-pandemic. Of the 32,000 plus homeless households, 62% of those who submitted applications to their local authority were aged between 25 to 49, 66%, two-thirds, single-person households, and 85% were of white ethnicity. And over half, 51% of applicants, had at least one support need. John, these are statistics that, and before we came on air, we did just talk about statistics, but there's a complex picture in amongst there, and it's not just reflected by numbers. There are real issues and real parts of this that need to be investigated and looked at properly within a proper context.
Well, you've raised so many issues there. I'm going to have to be selective, like the Reporting Scotland editor, about which ones I actually want to respond to. There, my first reaction is always the media headlines and the spin. We've had a real feeding frenzy in the last few days, quite a dark one on drug deaths, on alcohol deaths now, and on homelessness. So it's quite a trilogy, isn't it? There, I had a quick look. It's easily done. The reporting suggests these are the highest figures since records began. But if you just, all you have to do is Google ScotGov homelessness 2006, the last year of the Labour administration in Scotland. Applications for homelessness were 58,000, nearly twice as high as the level today. That's not being reported at all. I'm not saying for a minute this recent climb, which is partly to do with the pandemic, and partly to do with UK government control of a range of austerity measures. I'm not saying that doesn't matter, but it's clearly of interest to the public to know that, homelessness was far worse under the last Labour government. So we've not been seeing that. That's the main point I want to make about that. In fact, it might be the only point I want to make.
Indeed, it's fascinating in many ways that 2006, a point at which the Labour Party were in control of all the things, all the levers that Douglas Ross can consistently go on about that the Scottish Government has. But at that point, the Labour Party were presiding over what would appear to be a greater crisis in terms of one of those three, one of the trilogies that you mentioned there. And yet the media don't seem to be picking that up. One would almost suspect that there was a reason for that.
Yeah, you'd almost think that at editorial level there was an agenda there, wouldn't you, by the in particular by the British Broadcasting Corporation, to hide the successes of the Scottish Government. I'm not an uncritical fan of what the Scottish Government have done, but they've made major achievements which have been limited by their lack of control of the economy, which are just completely being ignored. And that's particularly true of perhaps I could just briefly mention the drug deaths, because it's not on our lineup for tonight, but there's a lot to say about the drug deaths figures. That 20% decline in 1 year, it correlates very precisely with the introduction of an opioid reversal drug called, let me think, naloxone. I think it's called naloxone, which is in libraries, in government offices. Police Scotland carry it. Some taxi drivers, I gather, have it in Edinburgh. All prisoners are given one when they leave. It's just a nasal spray, and you can ask for one. You can just email and ask for a naloxone spray, which you could use in an emergency. Now, Police Scotland started carrying those in February 2022, and in 2022, the opioid deaths plummeted. Most deaths are opioid, about 80% are opioid. They fell by about 300 in 1 year. That's not being mentioned. Now, that was a scheme that is the first in the world, and it was launched by the SNP government in 2021. Now, there will be other factors. I know these things are horribly complicated, complex, other factors in that fall in drug deaths, but you have to admit that the introduction of a scheme like that in 2021, and then very quickly a massive fall, a 20% fall, there must be some connection there, and that's been completely ignored.
Indeed. And going from what has been completely ignored to something that's very difficult to ignore, which is reports today that the UK government has delayed once more the post-Brexit border checks, this for a fifth time. The United Kingdom government has stated that it will delay the introduction of post-Brexit checks on food by another 3 months, meaning that new controls on imports will now not begin until the end of January 2024. The government had previously said that the new checks would be rolled out on the 31st of October this year. The decision to further delay implementing the new controls means that the phased introduction that was planned has been delayed by 3 more months since the previously stated October deadline. Controls of goods exported from the UK to the European Union have been in place since January 2021, meaning checks on goods from the European Union will begin a full 3 years later. Domestic food producers have previously complained that while they had to submit to checks, their business rivals in the EU had a free pass on importing to the UK. From the 30th of January, imports of items including medium-risk animal products, plants and plant products, and high-risk food of non-animal origin from the European Union will require health certificates, followed by physical inspections of these goods at the UK border from the end of April next year. In the final phase of control, safety and security declarations for European Union imports will come into force from the end of October 2024. Full customs controls for non-qualifying Northern Ireland goods will also be introduced from January, such as food and feed products that are not owned or processed in Northern Ireland by a registered or approved business. The government's border strategy, known as the Target Operating Model, or TOM for short, aims to better protect the UK against biosecurity threats by bringing in controls on imports from the EU for the first time and using Brexit freedoms to simplify import controls on goods from across the globe. Responding to the UK government's decision to further delay controls of goods, the SNP's business spokesperson Richard Thompson said that Brexit has been an unmitigated disaster for households and businesses across Scotland. With every day that passes, it gets much worse. He added that remaining outside the European Union continues to impose massive disadvantage and uncertainty on our business and people, stating that it's clear we need an alternative. John, so it looks like if you're sending stuff out, everything's sorted to get into the European Union. But the British border security and the British government can't work out how to take back our borders, which, if my mind sends me back to a referendum, was precisely what this was supposed to do. So it seems yet another example of things just not working.
It's just that, well, at the moment it's a never-ending story. A sequence of events and news reports that tell us that Brexit didn't work, hasn't worked, won't work, as many of us knew it wouldn't in the first place. I suppose the borders problem is partly to do with the inherent meanness of the Conservative government when it comes to public services. They're happy to avoid taxing the super rich and the corporations, but when it comes to spending money on something actually quite central to their own strategy, in other words, border control staff and facilities, they're not going to invest in that. They're just not going to do it, and they're just going to hope that it works, and it hasn't worked. And Brexit's like the Iraq War, and like the well, not so much the Iraq War, like the Vietnam War, and like the Ukraine War. It will end. We will be back. We will be back in the European Union. 10 years, perhaps at the most. It will take a further crisis. It will take further slaps in the face for everyone to realise this is not working, and we have to rejoin the European Union. I hope Scotland will break away and do it itself, first of all, but it will happen, like everything else.
Indeed, and we go from the inherent meanness of the Conservative Party onto an announcement today. Douglas Ross announcing that the Conservatives' economic strategy for Scotland unveiled to create a joint economic board comprising ministers from the Scottish and UK government. Criticising the Scottish Government's economic record, Mr Ross pointed to rises in income tax for those on higher salaries, while attacking Scotland's public services as unsustainable and on their knees. Douglas Ross said that Humza Yousaf had a £60 billion budget at his disposal and total control over devolved public services. He said that Scotland deserves a government that is focused on the real priorities of the Scottish people. Mr Ross wants to see more private sector involvement in the delivery of public services, a move which he claimed was necessary to tackle what he called Scotland's unsustainable public finances. In response to these statements, the SNP's economy spokesperson Stewart Hosey MP has said that the Conservatives are responsible for higher mortgage rates, soaring food prices and exacerbating the cost of living crisis, as well as Brexit, which he called economic vandalism and the biggest reason for economic decline in the UK. Mr Hosey concluded by stating that independence would put the key financial levers in the hands of the democratically elected Scottish Government. John, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I can find anybody in the Scottish population who really thinks that what they really need is more private enterprise within public services. But Douglas Ross seems to have found them in abundance.
Well, I can find one for you too. I can find one for you too. That'd be Anas Sarwar, and the Labour Party, UK Labour Party, which runs everything up here, is committed to further involvement of the private sector in the health services. Sarwar and his senior staff are all funded with wealthy donors from the private health industry helping to support them. That's clearly part of the new Labour agenda to help Scotland's NHS recover. And Anas Sarwar will go along with it as he's told to do. So it may be surprising actually as this gets looked at, that what Douglas Ross is suggesting is not a million miles away from what the Labour Party is suggesting for Scotland, and not just in the NHS. I should say that when I get the phone call asking me if I'll be on Broadcasting Scotland, usually around late afternoon, I have a quick look at the running order and hope there's nothing too difficult for me that I haven't thought about already. But this was one. I had a look and I thought, I've got no idea what Douglas Ross, and so I decided very quickly just to ignore it.
It's interesting. Every time I see a pronouncement from the Conservative Party, the following day I do make a point of seeing if it has ended up in a Labour Party press release. And it's an interesting, when you said that, you know nothing about it, one wonders if Douglas Ross knows anything about it. And certainly when it becomes Labour Party policy, whether Anna Sarwar is aware of it either. But one of the things that we did... Sorry, John.
No, I should say, and I have to give Douglas Ross some respect here. He did attend the local agricultural college just round the corner from where I live, and he did, I think, emerge with some kind of diploma in farming, with I think a specialism in bull castration. I seem to remember that was one of his favourites. So let's not suggest he's not a top academic here.
Well, yeah, indeed. The number of parallels that are running through my mind with regards to his specialism, I'll leave to one side, and we move on to a 2% increase in alcohol-specific deaths announced in Scotland today. And this comes from figures published by the National Records of Scotland, where they found that there were 1,276 alcohol-specific deaths registered in Scotland last year, which is a 2% increase from 2021. Female deaths have risen by 31 to 440, with male deaths unchanged at 836. Visiting a managed alcohol programme, MAP pilot in Glasgow, which provides people experiencing homelessness and long-standing alcohol dependency with a regular dose of alcohol in an accommodation-based project, Drugs and Alcohol Policy Minister Eleanor Whittam said that while we will need to better understand the reasons for this increase in deaths, I will do all I can to reduce alcohol-related harm. We will continue to work closely with alcohol and drug partnerships, the ADPs, and the third sector to address this public health priority backed by a substantial investment. This year, £113 million will be made available to ADPs to support local and national initiatives, ensuring that local services can respond to local needs. Adding that, we will address the unique challenges women face when accessing treatment, support and recovery, including stigma, while recognising that men still remain the highest risk of death. We are also working to ensure that people continue to receive the same quality of care as those with problematic drug use. We are supporting a review and update to clinical guidelines for alcohol treatment, which will introduce new approaches in a broad range of settings, including hospitals. This will help ensure anyone with problematic alcohol use receives the right treatment at the right time. And there is reference in there, John, to the issue of dual addiction of drugs and alcohol not being able to be completely separated. But this is, again, a fairly complex set of issues in the context of being a headline for somebody somewhere in order to beat others around the head with. But underneath it, there's something very serious that requires contemplation.
I think, again, I don't mean to undermine the importance of all of this, but at the same time, this is, my interest is in the media representation of these issues and how those images are used to politicise the situation and to undermine the whole independence movement. Essentially, if we can't look after our, control drug deaths and alcohol deaths, how can we be trusted to run a country? Is the implication. But again, this is the third, along with the drug deaths and the other that we've mentioned already. What was the other we mentioned already? I've forgotten already what the other was. But anyway, this is the third alcohol death. Now, again, the suggestion there's been some kind of major increase in alcohol deaths. Yesterday morning, the Reporting Scotland insert in BBC Breakfast, quite short, they found time to tell us that alcohol deaths were expected to rise, as they have, and they've risen by 2%, which is not statistically significant. And they were very keen, within about the third sentence, to remind us of drug deaths being the highest in Europe. In a piece that was about alcohol deaths, they had a quick go at drug deaths still being the highest in Europe, and almost with glee, someone on the programme suggested that alcohol deaths might now be as high as drug deaths. And it was almost with a sigh of relief as they watched drug deaths spiral away from their headlines. Oh, good, we can do the alcohol deaths. Very selective use of statistics. They look at they talk about them being the highest in 14 years. Interesting figure to choose, isn't it? 14 years. So from 2009 to 2014, that's the period they choose. Wonder why they didn't look at 2006, the last year of the Labour government here. The reason they didn't look at the last is that they were actually 11% higher in 2006. Alcohol deaths were 11% higher in the last year of the Labour Party than they are now, even though they've been climbing a bit recently. Now, the reason they're climbing, of course, is partly a wash effect from the pandemic, when they surged a bit during the pandemic after having fallen considerably under the Scottish Government in this period. So it's this very selective use of statistics it deceives people. You can understand why the average member of the public would just accept that. Things are getting worse. Things are getting worse, when clearly they're plateauing after a pandemic effect and at the end of a long downward spiral from Labour administration. Completely ignored.
I think that's perhaps one of the issues that the Scottish Government has to deal with that's quite taxing, is the fact that if you go back far enough to prior to any form of SNP government or administration, that they inherited from the previous administration quite difficult platforms in which to operate. And now they're at the point where, for some people, that there is a bit of fatigue that we've had the administration in power for such a long period of time and had two very noticeable and strong First Ministers. And that now that can be a bit of a challenge in order to get that long-term view of just exactly what the government has done during that time across.
I can understand why the Scottish Government, why ministers and senior civil servants in the Scottish Government wouldn't say what I've just said, because it would be immediately jumped on by the mainstream media as some kind of, attempt to, a whataboutery, they would say. It's when you compare statistics with England that show that we're doing better, for example, in public services, then people say indignantly, I don't care about that. I just care about how things are in Scotland. And if you compare with Labour all that time ago, they will say, but that was all that time ago. You've had plenty of time to do something about it. I know why they don't. I can see why they don't do it, but people like me can, I think, and I think many other many of the other keyboard warriors, as we're sometimes known, could and should be doing the same. It's a great things over. Scotland doesn't do this kind of thing anymore because he had an impact.
Indeed, and we go from the statistics there to very much an issue that has been at the forefront of the news over the last 24 to 48 hours, and it is a statement that has been released today by the UK Civil Aviation Authority as air traffic delays continue. They have released a statement specifically over the flight planning system, which is provided by the National Air Traffic Services, NATS, which experienced a technical failure on Monday, which meant flight plans had to be input manually by controllers. Rob Bishton, the interim chief executive at the UK Civil Aviation Authority, spoke of how he understood the challenges consumers were continuing to experience due to cancellations and delays caused by the technical issue, and added that passengers should expect to receive food and accommodation if delays were overnight. He went on to say that the UK Civil Aviation Authority continues to engage with NATS as part of its regulatory oversight, and that once NATS had completed its investigation, an incident report will be provided to the UK Civil Aviation Authority. He stated that the outcomes of this report will then be shared with the Secretary of State for Transport. Further advice from the Civil Aviation Authority suggests that consumers retain any receipts while organising what it calls reasonable care and assistance for themselves due to delays, as it may be possible to claim costs back at a later date. Airlines may provide guidance on reasonable costs, of course, in this area. It also advised that many passengers are unlikely to receive compensation for cancellations and delays due to the extraordinary circumstances. John, it does, and considering the things that we have spoken about, homelessness, drug deaths, alcohol deaths, this does feel a little bit like a first world problem, but it's certainly a very serious one. And you know, we've heard a lot about data breaches, and AI has been much in the news. Our dependence upon computing and so on does now and again seem to break down and lead to what are incredible issues and massive problems.
I agree. We're so, our lives are so embedded within information systems like this that, and I do appreciate that, you know, there have been these recent, you know, problems with networks of various kinds. Now, I'm not a techie person, but one of the things that I do understand is that institutions that know what they're doing and invest in it properly back everything up on a regular basis and employ staff who can actually protect the system. I think where things go wrong, it's not so much the technology that goes wrong, it's the failure of management in major organisations to actually have the necessary staffing to protect the institution from cyber attacks of various kinds, and I think to maintain systems and to back them up so that if something goes wrong, you just start it all up again. I don't understand. I'm not a techie person. I don't understand why these things happen, given that.
Indeed, and we go from something that has been in the news over the last 24 to 48 hours to something that has dominated sport headlines for around a week, and that follows today that Spanish Football Federation's regional presidents have demanded that Luis Rubiales immediately resign. The regional federation's presidents demanded that he resign, pulling support for the football chief days after its members heartily applauded his vow to stay on. On Monday, more than a week after Rubiales grabbed forward Jenny Hermoso by the head and kissed her on the lips, the federation's regional presidents were summoned to an extraordinary and urgent meeting in Madrid to assess the impact of the crisis. 6 hours later, they emerged, publishing a unanimous joint statement which read, "After the latest events and the unacceptable behaviours that have seriously damaged the image of Spanish football, we request that Mr. Luis Rubiales immediately present his resignation as president of the Spanish Football Federation." The demand was a seeming reversal from the scene that had played out at the Federation's meeting on Friday, where Rubiales, 46, repeated, "I will not resign," 5 times to vigorous applause from the members in attendance. His speech, which railed at fake feminism, was met with a standing ovation. Monday's statement, which made no mention of Jenny Hermoso by name, but that noted it was time for a new phase for the Federation, which, following Rubiales' suspension, is being led by his deputy Pedro Roca. The statement also called for the deep and imminent restructuring of the institution. While the statement added that it would maintain its commitment to continue implementing its investment and equality policies for the development of women's soccer, the regional leader Diaz de Marcos said the meeting did not address whether Jorge Vilda, the embattled coach of the Spanish women's national team, should stay on, despite the fact that he has no team and almost no coaching and technical staff. The statement leaves Rubiales with few allies. On Saturday, Vilda, along with the men's national team coach Luis de la Fuente, issued statements condemning Rubiales' behaviour. The statements, coming one day after both of them applauded his speech at the Federation, were seen as a sign that Rubiales was becoming increasingly isolated from those who had long protected him. The country's most powerful football clubs, from Real Madrid to Barcelona, have also condemned his behaviour. And on Monday, prosecutors at Spain's top criminal court said that they had launched a preliminary investigation into whether Rubiales' unsolicited kiss of Hermoso could constitute sexual assault. John, this was meant to be the pinnacle of women's football and sport, and we're talking about a man.
Yes. I think you have to say, though, from a positive perspective, this will turn out to be a good thing. He is gone. He may not know it yet, but he is gone. As you pointed out there, his friends were very quick to jump ship. Within about 24 hours of having applauded him, they were off condemning him. So I mean, it will. So it's going to be a good thing for Spanish football and for world football in the long run. It's tremendously sad, I suppose, for the Spanish women's football team, given their tremendous success, for this to follow on so quickly. But maybe when they all look back from a distance, they might think again this was a second win that they had. I was interested to discover. I had a quick look around. I don't normally investigate this kind of topic, but I discovered that Mr. Rubiales had actually finished his playing career at, would you guess it, Hamilton Accies in 2009. He played 4 games for Hamilton Accies before returning to Spain. He was a tough defender until he came to Lanarkshire. Discovered maybe he wasn't such a tough defender. So that's quite an interesting side story.
Indeed, I could just imagine if he managed to play against Motherwell, just how they treated him. And I think at that time Hamilton had a number of Spanish imports that had found themselves in Lanarkshire, no doubt with mining relatives from the 30s.
Of course.
So it's interesting you say that it could be a positive, because women's football has still got the leadership of men at its core and its centre. And perhaps now not just the coaching of women by women, which is increasingly beginning to turn over, because the more women who are retiring from international football and so on, the more are going into coaching. So there's a wider pool, if you like, of both genders from which to choose. But also in terms of administration, that's an area that oftentimes is overlooked in terms of leadership within the female game. So they might actually end up benefiting from people wanting to go in and take over and rub out, because FIFA, of all organisations in the world stage, do not have a very good record when it comes to being on the right side of anything, law or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, football is well behind the game here, undeniably well behind the game. I mean, England do have a woman as manager, and that's to be commended, and a very successful manager there. So, I mean, I agree that there's an awful lot of ground to cover here, and football, as I said, is well behind the game on this. But it might be this is a beginning, and we will see an improvement. Maybe it's taken something like this to give the system the kind of shock it needed. Although, I mean, you have to say it's been very slow moving on the issue of race. We're talking about gender here, but not so many black male football managers. I mean, I see we've got one in Burnley. That's about it, really, I think, in the top league in England.
It is indeed, and not many in Scotland either, to be fair. No. And we go from somebody who was tough in defence until he ended up in Lanarkshire, to a man who has been described as having a moral compass of an axe murderer, as a Georgia Republican has said just that about Donald Trump. This is from a Republican opponent in Georgia discussing the former president's legal predicament in the southern US state and elsewhere, but also his continuing dominance of the presidential primary. As Republicans, that dashboard, he said, is going off with lights and bells and whistles, telling us all the warning things we need to know, Jeff Duncan told CNN on Monday. Duncan was the Lieutenant Governor of Georgia when Trump tried to overturn his defeat there by Joe Biden in 2020. An effort that is now the subject of 13 racketeering and conspiracy charges. Duncan continued 91 indictments, fake Republican, $1 trillion worth of debt from his time in the White House, everything we need to see to not choose him as our nominee, including the fact that he's got the moral compass of a more like an axe murderer than a president. We need to do something right here, right now. This is either a pivotal point or our last gasp as Republican. Trump also faces charges for and denies wrongdoing over election subversion at the federal level, which is 4 counts, retention of classified information, 40, and hush money payments to a porn star, 34. Many observers suggest the Republican Party will be on a path to destruction if it picks Trump to face Biden again next year. Trump currently dominates national and key state polling, apparently suffering only minor damage after skipping the first debate in Wisconsin last week and indicating that he will skip all subsequent contests. Most observers expect Trump to lose a presidential election to Biden, but polling returns close contests and also shows most Americans think Biden is too old at 80 to serve a second term. Trump is 77, but fewer respondents think he is too old. Many more, however, think he is corrupt. John, what does this man have to do to become unpopular?
I think the good old party, the Republicans, are in a death spiral. They don't know it, but they're in a death spiral of some kind. And it may be that the only way they can kind of clean up and make sense of what they are is a bit like the Conservative Party in the UK at the moment. I think they have to lose, and lose badly, and then shed the skin a bit, get rid of some of that reptilian skin they've got, and try and start fresh. The Conservative Party will have to try and make sense of itself in the same way. Famous last words. I said I don't like to predict, and I don't. But judging by what I've read, Trump will be the Republican candidate, even if he's in prison at the time. He will be the candidate, but he will lose. Biden is far from impressive, but Biden is safe and human and has some aspect of concern for his own people, I think, in terms of what he does, and some aspect of concern, some degree of concern for world politics as well, for world peace. You know, there's a lot you could criticise in the right wing of the Democratic Party, but I think he'll win if he lives long enough to do so. Would be the first president to die from just tripping over something, I think, maybe. So that's maybe a bit of a sick joke. I think one of the main issues with regard to his age, of course, is who is his running mate. And hopefully he'll choose an intelligent and perhaps an intelligent woman to run alongside him. And then I think some kind of stability is there. You have to say, I've been, from my teenage days, concerned about the Vietnam War. I've been a major critic and personally unhappy about leadership in the United States across both parties. Really, I've been concerned, but you have to say they did survive. Democracy in the US, for all its flaws, has survived. They survived an attack on the Capitol. It's astonishing. They're going to survive again. The Democrats will win, and a similar thing will happen here. Centrist politicians will, who we're not entirely happy with, we're not inspired much by, will win in here, and we'll soon forget the extremes of our fat boy Trump, Boris Johnson. So let's not worry. It will be okay. I know I've been making a kind of repeated theme here of saying that all things are going to pass and it'll be fine in the long run. It's maybe what older people do.
Well, the old maxim, of course, is it will all turn out all right in the end, and if it's not all right, it's not the end. And I think one of the tricks, of course, that Trump managed to pull off was to convince people not to believe mainstream media, but to get all their information from what he was putting out and people who supported him, so that he bypassed the critics And of course, saying that he's not going to be part of these debates means that he's never going to be put under scrutiny, thus allowing him to appeal over the heads of what would be sensible, perhaps biased at times, but sensible mainstream media, and therefore continue to have that constituency. And it's just how far down that rump will go as to whether or not they will actually have a significant input in a presidential race in 2024.
What happened at the Capitol has scared a significant proportion of the US electorate. People who might actually, some people who might have voted for him on these supposed conservative values, and some people who might not have bothered to turn out. I mean, there are significant areas of the population, the black community, who have much to fear in Trump but didn't turn out. I think they've had such a scare here. I think the sensible majority here will turn out and take Biden through fairly safely, and hopefully he'll have a good running mate that we can trust to be president if things don't go so well for him.
And we go from the concerns and worries in America to good news today that Scottish child payment has reached more than 316,000 children and young people under the age of 16. New figures published today show that these families were benefiting from Scottish child payment by the end of June this year. The payment of £25 a week, which is unique in the United Kingdom, is now reaching 13,000 more families than it was in March of this year. The reported figures were well over the Scottish Fiscal Commission's forecasted average take-up in 2023-24 of 309,000. The Scottish Government has increased the payment not once but twice since its launch, first from £10 to £20 per week per child, then to £25 when it extended it to include all eligible children under 16 in November last year. The total amount going directly to lower income families is now more than £350 million since the payment's launch in February 2021. Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Shirley Ann Somerville, urged everyone who is eligible to apply and stated that the Scottish Child Payment is one of our key measures in tackling child poverty. It is an important safety net and one of the many actions we are taking in government to lift people out of poverty, adding that these statistics show the payment is reaching more of the children and young people who need it most. John, again, here's more statistics, but more human stories at the back of this, where there are real benefits being delivered directly to families who need it in the context of cost of living crisis, or the increase in fuel costs and so on. But it seems to not penetrate the mainstream.
Yes, that's exactly the point. I mean, this is a story that's almost impossible to spin. It's good, it's a good thing. There's no way around that. So the only way to deal with it, the opposition parties and the mainstream media, is to look the other way. This development, which is the equivalent of more than 3 million children in England and Wales who could be lifted out of a degree of poverty by this, was recognised by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation quite early in the process of it being developed and rolled out as a watershed in dealing with child poverty. Nicola Sturgeon said it's the thing she's most proud of, and I think she's absolutely correct in that assessment. If someone were to ask me, someone from another part of the world were to ask me, what's happening in Scotland, what good news has there been? I would say this, because it's not, I suspect it's not just unique in the UK. I suspect it's relatively unique. I appreciate there'll be some other countries in Northern Europe who are tackling child poverty with similar zest and energy. But I'd be very surprised if there's much happening in the world better than this. It's a tremendously good thing.
Indeed, and again, where the headlines come in terms of figures coming out, and you mentioned about the insert for BBC Breakfast, where here we've got, it's a terrible bit of news, and let's add in another terrible bit of news from our perspective, when in actual fact, there are real planks of recovery being put in place in order to try and lift the general population out of the poverty, which has been reinforced by policies elsewhere in another part of the United Kingdom. And that narrative just doesn't seem to penetrate.
No, bias by omission is well known to media theorists. It's the obvious strategy when you haven't got an answer to something. It's just to not talk about it. And we saw as well, I think it was this morning, saw another example actually, the case of a young woman from Aberdeenshire who had been forced to pay £7,000 to have her embryos frozen. She was born without a womb, and it cost her, the NHS Scotland wouldn't pay for the storage of her embryos, so she had to pay £7,000. But what the story didn't tell you, it was presented as as a negative for NHS Scotland. It didn't tell you that the NHS Scotland, its IVF scheme, tends to hit around 100%. That's about 100% of the people coming forward, and it's about 300 or 400 a year, are treated within weeks, within the target time. Perhaps one of the most effective IVF schemes in the UK and perhaps beyond. It leads to tremendous savings in terms of mental health problems for these women. That wasn't mentioned, but also wasn't mentioned, of course, was the fact that the young woman in question was educated at Huntley Gordon schools at £22,000 a year and spends £50,000 a year on her fast car racing hobby. So, I don't know I think her dad pays for it. He's presumably a businessman of some kind. But that was just omitted. I just saw the name and searched, and as you often do, you discover the people who have been presented by Reporting Scotland as members of the public turn out to be not ordinary members of the public at all.
Indeed, and it's that parcelling, that wrapping up of what are genuine stories that deserve to be reported in some manner, yet seem to be placed in a context that makes it difficult to argue with, but also worrying over the way in which they are presented.
Yes, I agree.
Absolutely. And we go from more good news. New national allowance for foster and kinship carers in tonight's final story, and it is the first time that foster and kinship carers across Scotland are to receive at least a standard national allowance to support them in caring for the children and young people they look after. Funded by a £16 million investment from the Scottish Government, the new Scottish Recommended Allowance, or SRA, will benefit more than 9,000 children. The introduction of the payment means every eligible foster and kinship carer will receive at least a standard national allowance in recognition of the valuable support they provide, no matter where they live. Following agreement with COSLA, this marks the first time a set rate, which all local authorities must pay, has been introduced across Scotland. Allowances were previously determined at a local level, and the SRA provides a minimum amount that must be paid in areas where local authorities are already paying above the national minimum allowance. Those rates will continue. The weekly allowances, which will be backdated to the 1st of April 2023, are foster and kinship carers of 0 to 4-year-olds at £168.31. 5 to 15-year-olds, taking in two bands, the 5 to 10 and the 11 to 15, both set at £195.81, and 16 years old and over at £268.41. Commenting on the allowance, Children's Minister Natalie Dawn said that introducing the Scottish Recommended Allowance for foster and kinship carers is another important step in our commitment to keep the promise and ensuring all care-experienced children and young people grow up loved, safe and respected. Further stating that this support will benefit thousands of families, helping them to provide the standard of living and well-being that the children and young people in their care deserve, and can be used to cover the cost of things like clothing, hobbies, activities and school trips. Councillor Tony Buchanan, COSLA Children and Young People spokesperson, said that COSLA is pleased to have agreed the Scottish Recommended Allowance for our foster and kinship carers. We realise that this has taken some time and are grateful to the Fostering Network, the Association for Fostering Kinship and Adoption Scotland, and Social Work Scotland for supporting COSLA and the Scottish Government in this area. More good news there, John, but also it's an interesting thing because in my day job, care experienced young people receiving their bursary to go to further education, which is a significant input to a care experienced young person's ability to be economically active. But also that supporting to kinship carers and to foster carers. The vast majority of children and young people in care are there through no fault of their own and have experienced significant trauma in their lives. And this is an attempt in some way to support the network of support for those children and young people. One wonders how Douglas Ross would see that in terms of his new strategy and whether or not fostering should in some way be privatised or kinship caring privatised and perhaps sponsored, I don't know, by a well-known retail outlet in order to make the cash available.
Well, we know what happens when you privatise care. It's very simple. There has to be a profit element. Shareholders expect some of the money. Privatisation doesn't work in a huge range of areas. People pretend it does, but that's because they want to make something out of it. This is another example of the kind of perhaps modest initiatives by the Scottish Government, which are designed to make life just that wee bit better in Scotland. The child benefit your child payment is the most newsworthy. It's the most significant, but there have been others. There's the compensation for the bedroom tax is something that applies across Scotland. That's enabled people to stay in their homes who might have been forced out in other parts of the UK. We've seen it, and something's very long established. Like free prescriptions for all, like tuition fees, bus passes for young people so they can get to university or to their apprenticeships. The list is enormous, and the trouble with that list, I think, for the Labour Party, is that it's a list of things that really a Labour Party would do if it were a proper Labour Party. And so that what we've seen now, since Alex Salmond marched to SNP from its archaic position, goodness knows where it was, marched it around the Labour Party, around Tony Blair's Labour Party, Blair and Brown, march it to the left of them, to take them on the left, then the SNP is the Scottish Labour Party. There is no other left-of-centre party of any significance. The Greens are a left-of-centre party, I agree, but there's no large left-of-centre party other than the SNP. And hopefully at the Rotherglen and Hamilton West by-election, the electorate of that area will get over what's happened in recent times and see that it's in their own interest to maintain that this is the only party that serves their interests.
Indeed, and talking of maintaining things, that is it for this evening. And before we go, firstly, John, thank you for being with us, and as always, contribution very much insightful and welcome. Thank you.
Pleasure, my pleasure. Thank you.
Before I go, I just want to remind, now it's been a while since I've done this, but it's important. And one of the things that we've talked about tonight is the way in which the media present certain things. And here at Broadcasting Scotland, we are committed to public service broadcasting. We are committed to providing free-to-view programming. We depend, however, on the generosity of our supporters. So, as always, those who have made a donation or making a monthly payment, thank you very much. If you are able to afford even £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. The reason for this is our need to reach £30,000, which is our target to stay open on an annual basis, and it's pressing. The generosity of supporters has given us a little time because we have raised more than half of that, £16,000, but we will only manage to keep going if we make the rest up. We will be able to continue making programmes for now, but our need to raise the remaining £14,000 is becoming really urgent. But from me here at Broadcasting Scotland, good night. Thank you for watching.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.